The sun clawed at the earth, relentless, turning the ground to a cracked mosaic of dust and despair. Her boots scuffed against the brittle dirt, each step a small rebellion against the weight dragging her down. She was a shadow in the vastness, her dress torn at the hem, her hands blistered from gripping the reins of a horse that wasn't hers anymore. The horizon shimmered, mocking her with promises of water, of rest, of anything but this endless stretch, of nothing. Her lips were cracked, her throat a furnace, but the canteen at her hip was long dry. She'd been left here traded, they said, for a saddle and a bottle of whiskey. The wagon's dust trail had faded 2 days ago, and with it the last shred of her name. The heat pressed against her chest, heavy as shame. She stumbled, catching herself on a jagged rock that bit into her palm. Blood welled slow and dark, but she didn't wipe it away. It was proof she was still alive, still moving, though the why of it eluded her. The sky was a cruel blue, unmarred by clouds, and the buzzards wheeled above, patient as priests. She thought of her mother's hands, soft ones, braiding her hair by candlelight. That was before the fever took her, before the men came with their promises and their lies, before the world decided she was worth less than leather and liquor. Knees buckled, and she sank to the ground, the dirt hot against her thighs. A faint sound stirred the silence hooves, steady and deliberate, not the thunder of her fevered mind. She raised her head, squinting against the glare. A figure emerged from the haze, a man on horseback, his hat low, his coat dusted with the same earth that clung to her skin. He didn't rush, didn't call out, just watched her, the way you'd watch a wounded animal you weren't sure was worth saving. She tried to stand, but her legs betrayed her, and she fell back, her breath a ragged gasp. The man dismounted, his boots crunching as he approached. He was lean, weathered, with eyes that held no warmth but no cruelty either, just a kind of knowing, like he'd seen this story before. He crouched beside her, close enough that she could smell the sweat and tobacco on him, the faint tang of horsehair. He didn't speak, just held out a canteen. She stared at it, then at him, her hands trembling as she reached. The water was warm, metallic, but it slid down her throat like mercy itself. He waited, patient, as she drank. When she finished, he took the canteen back, his fingers brushing hers rough, but not unkind. "You got a name?" he asked, his voice low, like gravel underfoot. She hesitated, the word caught in her throat. They'd taken that too, hadn't they? Called her girl, called her nothing. "Clara," she whispered, the name feeling foreign, like it belonged to someone who hadn't been left to die. He nodded, as if it didn't matter much either way. "Can you walk?" She tried again, her legs shaking but holding this time. He didn't offer a hand, just watched, his horse snorting softly behind him. The silence stretched, heavy with questions neither asked. She didn't know if he was savior or opportunist, but the buzzards were still circling. She wasn't ready to be their meal dart. He turned back to his horse, loosening the saddlebag. "Got a camp a few miles off," he said, not looking at her. "You're welcome to it, if you can keep up." It wasn't a promise, not even close, but it was something. She nodded, her throat too tight for words, and followed him into the shimmering heat, the horizon swallowing them both. The desert didn't care about her survival, didn't care about the man who'd stopped for her. It stretched on, indifferent, as the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in bruises of orange and purple. Her steps were slow, each one a battle, but she kept her eyes on his back, on the steady rhythm of his horse's hooves. Somewhere in the distance a coyote wailed, its cry sharp and lonesome. She felt it in her bones, that sound, like it was calling her back to the nothing she'd come from. Asterisk, asterisk, the fire crackled low, spitting sparks into the night. Clara sat close, her hands outstretched, the warmth seeping into her fingers like a hesitant gift. The desert cold had come fast, sinking into her bones as the stars burned sharp above. The manly, he'd said, just once worked quietly, skinning a rabbit with a blade that gleamed in the firelight. His movements were sure, the knife slicing through flesh with a rhythm that felt older than the land itself. She watched the blood drip, dark against the sand, and her stomach twisted. Hunger warring with memory. She saw her brother's face, pale and still. The last time she'd held his hand, he'd been too young to survive the fever, too small to but fight the way she had. The men who took her after her father's creditors, they called themselves, had promised a new start, a home, a purpose. Instead, they'd bartered her like a sack of grain, her worth measured in what she could carry or endure. The last one, a trader with a crooked smile, had laughed as he handed her reins to a stranger for that saddle. She'd been too tired to cry then, too empty. Now, sitting by Eli's fire, the ache of it clawed at her chest, sharp as the wind cutting through the sagebrush. Eli didn't look at her, just skewered the rabbit and set it over the flames. The smell of roasting meat filled the air, heavy and rich, pulling her back to the present. Her mouth watered, but she kept still, afraid to seem greedy. He'd given her water, a blanket, a place by the fire, more than anyone had in months. But trust was a luxury she couldn't afford, not when every kindness had come with a price. "You eat much today?" His voice broke the silence, low and rough, like he wasn't used to asking questions. She shook her head, her eyes on the fire. He grunted, tearing a piece of meat from the spit and holding it out. She took it, her fingers brushing the calluses of his palm again. The meat was hot, greasy, and she ate slowly, savoring the warmth as much as the taste. He watched her, not staring, but noticing, his eyes catching the way her hand shook, the way she curled into herself against the cold. The night deepened, the stars a relentless sprawl above. Somewhere, an owl hooted, its call swallowed by the vastness. Clara's thoughts drifted to the wagon, to the men who'd left her. She saw their faces, blurred by dust and time, heard their laughter as they rode off. She'd been nothing to them, less than nothing. But Eli hadn't left her there, hadn't ridden past. She didn't know why, and that not knowing gnawed at her, a quiet fear beneath the hunger and the cold. He leaned back against a rock, his hat tipped low, the fire casting shadows across his face. "Got a place up north," he said, almost to himself. "Small spread, not much, but it's mine." She waited, unsure if he expected a response. He didn't look at her, just kept talking, his words slow, like stones dropped into a still pond. "Need someone to help with the horses, maybe mend some clothes. You any good with a needle?" She swallowed, the meat heavy in her throat. "I can learn," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. She'd sewn before, clumsy stitches to patch her brother's shirts, but that was years ago, before everything broke apart. Eli nodded, like her answer was enough for now. The fire popped, sending a spark drifting upward, lost against the stars. Clara pulled the blanket tighter, her eyes tracing the flames. She remembered her mother's voice, singing soft hymns in the dark, the only warmth in a house gone cold. That was gone now, buried with her brother, with the life she'd once known. But here, in this stranger's camp, there was fire, food, a chance to keep moving. She didn't know if it was hope or just survival, but it was something, and she clung to it. Fragile as it was, the desert stretched beyond the firelight, silent and unyielding. Eli's horse snorted softly, tethered nearby, and the wind carried the faint scent of sage. Clara closed her eyes, the heat of the fire on her face, and for the first time in days, she didn't hear the buzzards. The dawn came slow, a thin line of gold bleeding into the gray. Clara woke to the smell of coffee, bitter and sharp, curling from a tin pot over the rekindled fire. Her body ached, every muscle stiff from the cold ground, but the blanket had held through the night, a small shield against the desert's bite. Eli was already up, tending to his horse, his hands moving over the animal's flank with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his weathered face. The mare nickered softly, her breath clouding in the chill morning air. Clara watched him, her own breath shallow, unsure if she should move or speak. She stood folding the blanket with care, her fingers lingering on the rough wool. It smelled of smoke and horse, but it was warm, and that was enough to make it precious. Eli glanced her way, his eyes catching the way she smoothed the fabric, like it was something she might not see again. He didn't comment, just poured coffee into a dented cup and set it near her. She took it, the heat stinging her palms, and sipped slowly, the bitterness grounding her, pulling her back from the edge of memory. The ride north was quiet, the only sounds the creak of leather and the steady clop of hooves. Clara sat behind Eli on the mar, her arms loose around his waist, her cheek pressed against the dust of his coat. The desert gave way to scrubland, then to rolling hills dusted with dry grass. She felt the rhythm of the horse, the rise and fall of its breath, and it steadied her, even as her mind wandered back. She saw the trader's crooked smile again, the glint of coins changing hands. She'd stood there, silent, as they haggled over her like livestock, her worth measured in what she could fetch. The memory burned, but she pushed it down, focusing on the sway of the horse. The faint green of the hills ahead. Eli's spread was modest, a low cabin of weathered wood nestled against a stand of cottonwoods. A corral held 2 horses, their coats gleaming in the morning light, and a small barn leaned slightly, as if tired from years of wind. He helped her down, his hand steady but brief, then led the mare to the corral. Clara stood by the cabin, her boots rooted to the earth, the weight of this new place pressing against her. It wasn't home, not yet, maybe never, but it was solid, real, more than the dust and buzzards she'd left behind. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine and old smoke. A single room, spare but clean, with a rough table, a stove, and a narrow bed, covered in a patched quilt. Eli gestured to a chair, and she sat, her hands clasped tight in her lap. He moved to the stove, pulling out a skillet, his silence comfortable, like he didn't need words to fill the space. She watched him crack eggs, the sizzle loud in the quiet, and her stomach growled, betraying her again. He didn't smile, but his eyes softened, just for a moment, as he slid a plate toward her. "You'll earn your keep," he said, not unkindly. "Horses need tending, clothes need mending. I ain't got time for both." She nodded, the eggs hot on her tongue, the yolk rich and warm. She didn't know horses, didn't know much beyond survival, but she could learn. She'd learned to endure worse hunger, betrayal, the weight of being nothing. This was different, a chance to be something, even if it was just a shadow in a stranger's home. Outside, the wind stirred the cottonwoods, their leaves whispering secrets to the sky. Clara ate in silence, the plate warm against her hands, and thought of her mother's hymns, the way they'd filled the dark. She didn't know if she could trust Eli, didn't know if this place would hold her or break her. But the eggs were warm, the cabin solid, and for now, that was enough. The hills rolled on beyond the window, green and gold, and the buzzards were gone, their shadows replaced by the faint hope of something new. Asterisk, asterisk, the days bled into one another, marked by the rhythm of chores and the slow thaw of silence. Clara learned the weight of a curriculum the way a horse's flank twitched under her hesitant touch. The animals were patient, their eyes dark and knowing, and she found a strange comfort in their warmth, the steady huff of their breath. Eli taught her in fragments how to clean a hoof, how to mend a torn shirt with uneven stitches. He didn't praise, didn't scold, just nodded when she got it right, his silence louder than words. The cabin became a refuge, its walls holding the heat of the stove, the scent of pine and coffee, but trust hung between them like a spider's thread, fragile and swaying in the wind. At night, when the fire burned low, Clara's mind wandered. She saw her brother's small hand in hers, felt the fever's heat through his skin. She remembered the trader's voice, sharp and careless, as he handed her over for that saddle. The memory was a bruise, tender and deep, and it pressed harder when Eli's eyes lingered on her, never cruel, but searching, like he was trying to read a language he didn't know. She wondered what he saw, a girl broken by the world or something worth saving. She didn't ask. Some questions were too heavy to carry. One morning, as the frost glittered on the grass, Eli handed her a needle and a pair of his trousers, the knee worn thin. "Try again," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. She sat by the window, the light catching the dust motes, and worked the needle through the fabric. Her stitches were clumsy, but they held, and when she handed the trousers back, Eli ran his thumb over the patch, nodding. "Good enough," he said, and something in her chest loosened, like a knot slipping free. That afternoon, she followed him to the corral, the air sharp with the promise of winter. He showed her how to saddle the mare, his hand steady as he adjusted the cinch. "She trusts you," he said, patting the horse's neck. Clara's throat tightened. Trust, the word felt foreign, like a coin she'd never held. She reached out, her fingers brushing the mare's mane, and the horse leaned into her touch, warm and solid. For a moment, the world was just the two of them, her and the mare, the wind whispering through the cottonwoods. But the past wasn't done with her that night. As she lay on the pallet by the stove, she dreamed of the wagon, of the trader's laugh, of her brother's fevered eyes. She woke, gasping, her hands clawing at the blanket, the dark pressing in like a living thing. Eli stood on his bed across the room, his shadow shifting in the faint glow of the embers. "You all right?" His voice was low, sleep-rough, but there was no judgment in it. She nodded, though he couldn't see, and curled tighter into the blanket, her heart pounding against her ribs. The next day, she found a small book on the table, its cover worn soft, the pages yellowed. "Found it in town," Eli said, not looking up from the harness he was mending. "Thought you might read." She opened it, her fingers trembling, and saw poems, words that danced like the wind over the hills. She read haltingly, her voice barely above a whisper, but the words felt alive, like they could hold the pieces of her together. Eli listened, his hands still, and when she finished, he didn't speak, just nodded like he'd heard something. He understood. The hills turned golden, the air colder, and Clara felt the weight of a choice she hadn't named. She could stay, learn the horses, the needle, the quiet rhythm of this life. Or she could run, keep moving, let the desert swallow her again. The thought of leaving ached, but so did the thought of staying, of letting herself hope. The cabin was warm, the mare trusted her, and Eli's silence was no longer a war but a space where she could breathe. Outside, the cottonwoods swayed, their leaves falling like promises, and Clara felt the pull of something new, something she wasn't ready to name. Asterisk, asterisk, the first snow dusted the hills, a soft veil that softened the edges of the world. Clara stood by the corral, her breath clouding in the cold, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that burned through her gloves. The mare snorted, nosing at the frost-covered grass, and Clara watched, her heart caught between the quiet beauty of the morning and the weight of her own uncertainty. She'd been here weeks now, long enough to know the creak of the cabin's door, the rhythm of Eli's steps, the way the horses turned their heads when she approached. But knowing a place didn't make it hers, and the fear of being unmoored again clung to her like damp cloth. She thought of the trader's laugh, the way it had echoed in her ears as the wagon rolled away. She thought of her mother's hymns, faint now, like a melody half remembered. The past was a shadow she couldn't outrun, but here, in the cold light of dawn, it felt farther away, diluted by the smell of pine and the warmth of the mug in her hands. Eli emerged from the barn, a coil of rope over his shoulder, his hat dusted with snow. He didn't look at her, just nodded toward the cabin. "Storm's coming," he said. "Best get inside." She followed, the wind nipping at her heels, and helped him shutter the windows, their hands moving in a quiet dance of necessity. The cabin was warm, the stove crackling, and Clara felt the weight of the choice she'd been avoiding. Staying meant trusting not just Eli, but herself, her ability to build something from the ashes of what she'd lost. Leaving meant the desert again, the buzzards, the endless road. She sat by the fire, her hands idle for once, and watched the flames lick at the wood. Each snap a small defiance against the cold. Eli sat across from her, mending a bridle, his fingers deft despite their roughness. "You ever think about where you'd go?" he asked, his eyes on the leather. The question caught her off guard. A stone dropped into still water. She opened her mouth, then closed it, her thoughts tangling. Where would she go? There was no home to return to, no family waiting. The world beyond the hills was a blank page, and she didn't know if she had the strength to write on it. Asterisk, asterisk, I don't know, she said finally, her voice small but steady. Never had much to go toward. He nodded like he'd expected the answer and kept working, the needle flashing in the firelight. The silence wasn't heavy, but it pressed against her, urging her to speak. "Why'd you stop for me?" The words slipped out before she could stop them, raw and unguarded. Eli's hand stilled, his eyes meeting hers for the first time that day. They were gray, like the sky before a storm, and held something she couldn't name, sorrow, maybe, or recognition. "Seen too many left behind," he said, his voice low. "Didn't want to be one who kept riding." He looked back at the bridle, his fingers moving again, and Clara felt the air shift, like a door cracking open. She wanted to ask more who he'd lost, what ghosts haunted his silences, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she picked up the book of poems, her fingers tracing the worn cover, and read aloud, her voice stronger now, filling the space between them. The storm came. That night, the wind howling like a wounded thing, snow piling against the cabin walls. Clara lay on her pallet, listening to the world rage outside, and felt something settle in her chest. Not peace, not yet, but a quiet resolve. She could stay, learn the horses, the needle, the shape of this life. She could risk hope, even if it scared her. The fire's glow lingered in the dark, and she thought of the desert, of the cracked earth and the buzzards. They were still out there, but they weren't here. Not now. Asterisk, asterisk. The snow fell steady now, blanketing the hills in a hush that felt like forgiveness. Clara stood at the cabin's window, her breath fogging the glass, her fingers tracing the frost that clung to the edges. The world outside was soft, unbroken, the cottonwoods bowing under the weight of white. Inside, the fire snapped, its warmth curling around her like a promise she was still learning to believe. She'd chosen to stay not with words, but with the quiet act of rising each morning, tending the horses, mending Eli's shirts with stitches that grew steadier by the day. The choice wasn't loud, but it was hers, and that was enough. Eli was out in the barn, his shadow moving through the snow, a lantern's glow trailing him like a star. She watched him, her heart a tangle of gratitude and fear. He'd given her a place, a purpose, but he was still a stranger in ways she couldn't name. His silences held stories she hadn't earned, losses he didn't share. Once, as she'd brushed the mare, he'd mentioned a sister, her name slipping out like a breath, Lila, gone too young. He hadn't said more, but Clara saw the weight of it in the way his hands stilled, the way his eyes drifted to the hills. She turned from the window, her hands finding the book of poems. The pages were softer now, worn from her touch, the words a quiet anchor. She read them aloud sometimes, when Eli was near, her voice weaving through the crackle of the fire. He never commented, but he listened, his hands pausing over a harness, or a knife, his face unreadable but present. It was enough to make her feel seen, not as a girl traded for a saddle, but as Clara, someone who could fill a room with words even if they weren't her own. The mare nickered outside, and Clara set the book down, pulling on her coat. The cold bit at her face as she stepped into the snow, her boots sinking deep. She made her way to the corral, the lantern light spilling from the barn. Eli was there, checking the horses, his breath clouding as he murmured to them. She joined him, her hands sure now as she brushed the mare's flank, the rhythm familiar, grounding. The horse leaned into her, warm and solid, and Clara felt a quiet strength settle in her bones. "You're good with her," Eli said, his voice cutting through the silence. She glanced at him, surprised, her cheeks warming despite the cold. He didn't look at her, just kept working. But the words lingered, a small gift. She wanted to say something back, to ask about Lila, about the life he'd lived before her, but the moment passed. Carried away by the snow's soft fall, they walked back to the cabin together, the lantern swinging between them, its light dancing on the snow. Inside, the fire was low, the air thick with the smell of pine and coffee. Clara sat by the hearth, her hands idle, and felt the weight of the past loosen, just a little. The trader's laugh was fainter now, her brother's fevered eyes softer in her memory. She wasn't whole not yet, but she was here, alive, with a horse that trusted her and a man who'd stopped when no one else had. The storm had passed, leaving only silence in its wake. Outside, the hills gleamed under the dawn's first light, the snow untouched, a canvas of quiet possibility. Clara looked at Eli, his face lit by the fire's glow, and saw not a savior, but a man carrying his own ghosts, offering what he could. She thought of the desert, the cracked earth where she'd been left, and how far she'd come. The buzzards, were gone, their shadows lost in the snow, and in their place was something new alive she could build, one stitch, one step, one word at a time.